Salams from the People's Dispatch Studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Ani and you're watching Daily Debrief, your primer on some of the top international news stories of the day. With me on the show today to talk about our stories from Amazon strikes to the tragic deaths of migrants in the English Channel is Prashant. First up, Amazon workers today in at least 20 countries are staging strikes and protests as part of a day of action coordinated through the global Make Amazon Pay coalition. Black Friday, the day after the US holiday of Thanksgiving, is the biggest sales event of the year for the trillion-dollar online retailer, alongside Cyber Monday 3 days later. The workers' demands include improved workplace conditions, job security, respect for the right to unionize, and more environmentally sustainable operations. The International Day of Action highlights the outsized role that Amazon plays in the global economy, with similar challenges facing the corporation's 1.3 million workers spread out over nearly every continent. Prashant, despite oppositions from the management side, how are the workers managing to coordinate this strike action?
Right, Siddhant, before that, I'll just come to some of the numbers you mentioned, which is that it's a trillion-dollar company.
Yeah.
Important thing to note, it became a trillion-dollar company during the pandemic,
Yeah.
at a time when, many companies, many small enterprises were shutting down, struggling, across the world. Amazon became a trillion-dollar company. It benefited a lot. Let's be very clear from the pandemic. Point number one. Point number two, its owner Jeff Bezos was the first person to cross the net worth of $200 billion. Again, key moment. He's recently gone to space. We'll probably talk about it later. But the fact is that Amazon today is not just any company, right? It's something more than that. It is almost a force in its entirety. If you look at, for instance, its climate change, its contribution to climate change.
Impact,
if you look at, for instance, its employee numbers, 1.3 million employees. That's a massive number. If you look at its revenues, which are probably much more than many countries in the world. So what we're seeing right now is actually a company which is almost, in some senses, a country of its own. And at this point, this company has an obligation to to pay back, which is really the name of the campaign. Like you said,
Right.
it's Make Amazon Pay.
Yeah.
And the important thing to note here is that it's Make Amazon Pay in various ways. Starts with something as basic as pay salaries, pay proper salaries, allow workers, for instance, the right to unionize, which is a very important one. There was recently a very sustained effort in Bessemer in the state of Alabama in the United States, where employees attempted to unionize. Amazon was accused of using union-busting tactics to actually prevent employees of just one warehouse, mind you.
Right.
Just one warehouse from unionizing. Again, similarly, other controversies around other warehouses also. And this is across the world. If you look at, for instance, the strikes that are being planned, there are strikes in Cambodia, in Bangladesh, in India, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, of course. In every part of the world, when we see Amazon employees protesting, this can't just be one country's problem. There's definitely a structural problem here.
Absolutely.
And that is what I think the Make Amazon Pay coalition is trying to focus on. The fact that, if you look at the members of the Make Amazon Pay coalition, it's actually a very vast variety. There's a Progressive International. There are many trade unions, some of which are small, local, some of which are national, with hundreds of thousands of members. So all of them have a very, very similar set of demands. And if you look at some of these demands also, they're broadly categorized into a variety of sections. One, allowing workers the right to unionize, improving working conditions. There have been very horrifying stories of how workers in say warehouses, for instance, are not even allowed to take basic breaks for bodily functions. So allowing workers to unionize, increasing pay, improving working conditions, making sure that Amazon respects the data and the privacy of users, making sure that Amazon, for instance, does not use or does not contribute to fossil fuel giants. So there's this wide variety of progressive demands, I think, across the world, all of which together are really functioning as the anchor for this campaign. And it's very important because I think over the past many years, people across the world have reached this understanding that it is essential to make Amazon Pay. It is essential to ask not only Amazon, but companies like Facebook, companies like Google, companies like Microsoft, more significant questions than you would ask your mom and pop store or your
local retailer
or your small scale industry, because the kind of impact, the outsized impact these are having through the network effect, and the way they're changing people's minds, changing people's behaviors, it is actually very important to actually make them socially accountable as well.
Absolutely. So we've seen over the years and months, Bezos doing all kinds of things, including, like you mentioned, thank Amazon employees for sending him on that joyride to almost space. But stopping short of actually doing anything to improve the conditions of these 1.3 million, essentially, if you look at it as a country, then citizens that belong to Amazon. How should the world be dealing with billionaires?
Good question, because like you said, for instance, the fact that a recent ProPublica report has had some very negative things to say about Jeff Bezos' payment of taxes, apparently he did not pay taxes for many years. In fact, the numbers say that in 2019, Amazon just paid just 1.2% tax in the United States.
Right.
And this is up from 0% 2 years ago, in the 2 previous years. So this is actually a very appalling record, and this actually shows multiple things. One, the fact is that modern finance, modern commerce has now been structured in such a way that it is easy for companies to bypass a lot of these regulations, whether they be regulations in terms of data, whether they be regulations in terms of taxes. And it has become easy for companies to bypass all these regulations and actually set up shop in countries where they have to pay the least amount of taxes.
Right.
So one step, of course, is what we recently saw, which is there was a call for a 15% global tax on corporates, big corporates. And that is still a long way from being passed, by the way. That's still an in-principle agreement.
Yeah.
But it is still a long way from being passed. But in answer to your larger question, which is how people should treat billionaires, the simple answer is don't valorize them, because billionaires are billionaires because of the work of all of us for many hundreds and millions of people, and
over probably hundreds of years.
Exactly, and through the kind of extraction of their work, very bad working conditions, it's very difficult to find a billionaire whose fortune has been built on the happiness of their workers. Let's just make it very clear over there.
Yeah.
So what we're looking at is ideally the possibility of more taxation, something that is being strongly resisted by these right-wing sections, by the economic right wing in many parts of the world. The idea of a progressive taxation system which will actually, which will not tax the working class and the middle class so much, but those who have had a particular amount of fortune, their money, obviously the need for taxing is much higher. The argument, of course, is that these people made their money, they were brilliant geniuses. That's really what we're questioning. Of course, they might be brilliant, but the fact is that they definitely did not make their money on their own. So I think there are a raft of proposals in various parts of the world, and we've seen how the number of billionaires has risen drastically during the pandemic. The number of, the inequality is worsening in countries like the United States, India, South Africa, horrible records of inequality. If you look at, say, 1 or 2 people owning as much wealth as a large chunk of the bottom section of the population. So I think for people's movements, for political parties, this is a huge challenge. This is going to be one of those questions which is increasingly going to be very urgent to address, especially when we have something like climate change happening, where those who are at the bottom are going to suffer the most. The richer people, for instance, are going to have a much better time. They're going to escape to the, to space or through more hospitable locations. But the key question really is that, can there be sustained political will in countries across the world to clamp down on the fortunes of billionaires?
Because governments are also, of course, funded by the same profits in many ways. All right. Moving on now to an extremely tragic story. The United Nations Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, said on Thursday that urgent action is needed to avoid a repeat of tragedies such as this week's drowning of at least 27 people in the English Channel. It's the single largest loss of life in the Channel since 2014, when the UN's migration agency started recording the data. Another 106 migrants were rescued in French waters on Wednesday alone. More and more people are being forced to attempt the journey or other journeys in small, unseaworthy boats in an attempt to get away from war, poverty and persecution. Data since 2014 says that 166 migrants have been recorded dead or missing in the English Channel, and 22,930 have been recorded dead or missing in the Mediterranean Sea. Prashant, it's a crisis that goes way beyond just the numbers.
Absolutely. Although the numbers are very telling, actually, because let's take a look at one important number. For instance, the fact that this year alone, the number of sea crossings from France to the United Kingdom has increased from 8,000 in 2020 to 23,000 so far this year. Now, why has this happened? We're talking about a very narrow stretch, which is the English Channel, where this accident took place. It's just about 20 kilometers. But nonetheless, imagine the number of crossings, 23,000 crossings. So one reason this has taken place is the fact, of course, that due to the pandemic, other ways of traveling from France to England have become severely diminished, which means that boats, sometimes very, like you said, unseaworthy boats, very ramshackle boats are the only option for many to try to travel. Now, important question, who are these people? These people are, the government, the UK government, for instance, has tried to say that these people are economic migrants, which means that it gives the impression that these are greedy people traveling in search of, a better life in the Golden West, where they will get great jobs and that kind of thing. And this is a rhetoric which has kind of pervaded the issue of refugees across the world, portraying them as basically greedy people who don't want to stay in their homes, who want to come to better places and get jobs there. But if you look at the numbers, if you look at the composition of the refugees, the fact is that most of these refugees are from war-torn regions. They're from Syria, they're from Sudan, They're from, say, West Asia, Afghanistan, all these countries.
Eritrea.
Iraq, for that matter, most of the people who died most of the 27 people were from Iraqi Kurdistan. So the key question is that why are these people fleeing their countries? These people are fleeing their countries because the West brought war to these countries. We cannot deny that. And this is the discussion. This is one argument you will not find in any discussion, especially in the Western media. There'll be all this talk about law and, say even the more good-natured, the people who are a bit more kind, they'll be talking about, legal measures. But the key question here is that the West brought war to these regions. And when people are fleeing them, how can the West say that, we are not really going to care so much about them, or it's somebody else's responsibility? So what we're seeing is that France and Britain are kind of having a bit of an argument, both countries saying that we'll work together, but also hinting that it's the other country's responsibility. But the key question here is that why are these refugees going? And the reason is because of conflict. Now the fact is that many of these refugees have family members in some of these countries, maybe, or earlier people who have gone there seeking asylum or refuge. They have family members there, which is why they're going there. So the big issue here right now is that how do we ensure that a lot of these refugees have their dignity, have their lives safe, have a proper chance at getting some kind of asylum, a proper chance at getting some kind of security. And this is where I think the European response, especially the British response, has been extremely horrible, in the sense that whether it be in terms of the legal measures they're thinking about, whether it be in terms of the government's approach, what we're seeing is a very negative, very regressive kind of approach, looking at it basically as a law and order problem, as a smuggling issue, as though the only issue here is combating smugglers. Now, everyone knows smuggling is an issue, but that's really not the only issue here. And by reducing it to just about tackling smuggling, they're doing people a huge injustice.
Right. So you mentioned this law that is in the pipeline. The UK's Home Secretary Preeti Patel is under fire for some of this proposed legislation, and there are several sort of matters in court as well. So
So the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is what it's called, is actually a pretty harsh and restrictive bill, and it cuts down the options for people who are trying to seek a refuge. Now the government has issued a lot of claims. It says it makes it safer. It says it makes it less costly for the British. It says that it makes things more structured. But most of these arguments have been busted by organizations such as Amnesty, which have issued detailed counter-arguments which say that actually this makes things far more difficult for refugees. So one of the key issues is the fact that there is no legal channel for refugees to enter the United Kingdom, and which really makes the situation difficult. So if you need to apply to asylum, you have to be in a country. But if there's no legal channel to apply to reach that country, how exactly do you get there? So now there are these famous cases of people who go somewhere and, they may get a legal channel. But what about the tens of thousands of people who don't have that, right? So there's actually a host of issues which actually restrict the freedom or the possibility of migrants from doing so. So the understanding of the UK government seems to be that, and governments across the world, that if you cut down the options by which migrants can reach a country, it'll stop migration, it'll stop refugees. Although all research shows that is not the case. What happens is that then people go for more risky routes, people go for more illegal routes, so to speak, like for instance smuggling gangs. So the flow is not going to stop because you have caused a crisis somewhere else. So the flow of refugees is not going to stop. So the simplest way and the best way, the most humane way, is actually to treat migrants and refugees as human beings, offer them an equal path, a path to a particular kind of humane treatment. But if you try to basically just restrict their options and hope that, okay, people are going to be intimidated by the challenges and will go back, that's not the case. In fact, there's been some excellent reporting about how even the day after this drowning happened, after 27 people were killed, people were still jumping on boats from the French coast trying to cross over, just the day after. So it was not that, the news of people dying or the news of people being arrested is going to stop the refugee crisis, because people are in a desperate situation. That is why they are in, they're in these places. Why would people leave their homes? Why would people leave places where they lived for generations and go to struggle to a foreign country?
Thousands of miles away and try to start
Exactly.
life from
It is because those regions have often been destroyed. They have been wrecked. The natural resources have been extracted. And all this is not factored in many of these discussions, which is what I'm saying. So a very controversial bill. The government is probably likely to get this passed, of course, because these are really concerns which nobody wants to talk about. The establishment would rather prefer to be like an ostrich with its head buried under the sand, going by this whole old logic that all it needs is better enforcement and better legal structures.
On to the United States now, where after more than 21 months since the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, The 3 white perpetrators have been found guilty by a jury in the United States. On November 24th, a jury from the state of Georgia returned a unanimous verdict convicting Travis McMichael, his father Greg McMichael, and their neighbor William Roddy Bryan in the killing of Arbery. The 3 were convicted on charges of murder, aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and criminal intent to commit a felony. Anish is here to tell us more about why this verdict, Anish, is firstly is important for us to be following.
Well, in many ways, it became part of the larger anti-racism protests that happened after the murder of George Floyd. But at the same time, it also showed a kind of connivance between actors of the state and the perpetrators themselves.
Right.
We have to remember that at least 2 of the district attorneys who were supposed to be prosecutors in the case, they had to recuse themselves because of conflict of interest. And in one of those cases, you actually already have an obstruction of justice charge against the district attorney. And this was because the attorney herself was working very closely with Greg McMichael, the father of the one who actually shot Ahmaud Arbery. So in that way, you can actually look at the case as a sort of hallmark of how the system really is pitched against you if you're somebody who comes from a racial minority, especially if you're black in the United States, especially in a state like Georgia, which is part of the the deep south US. So in that way, we can also see other kinds of ways where roadblocks were put up. For instance, the hate crimes charge was never taken up by the jury or the judge who was presiding in the case at Brunswick County. And part of the reason they were saying is because they were not very sure if social media posts or messages could be taken as evidence of the perpetrators' hatred racism. Or racism. And at the same time, when the jury selection happened and hundreds of jurors were interviewed and vetted, of the 12 jurors who sat for the trial, 11 were white and only 1 was black. So this was also a sort of skewed jury. So the judgment the verdict actually comes across quite surprising in many ways. So, because of the kind of roadblocks that were there, but it was something that was necessary, and it also showed that even with the limited number of charges, if you take out the hate crimes part, the perpetrators were in the wrong because of the very facts that they were trying to themselves put up.
Right. So we will move on though to a federal hate crimes hearing in this case, right? And how do you see that going forward?
In many ways, so all 3 of them are charged in a single charge of interference of rights, which is basically a hate crimes charge. So the intention is and it was something that was moved by the Biden administration's Justice Department earlier this year, partly because there was a very clear intentionality on the part of the perpetrator, especially Travis McMichael, who actually used racist slurs while he was standing over the body of Ahmaud Arbery after shooting him and while talking to the police, So this kind of very clear sort of racist tendencies from the perpetrators, also considering the fact that they followed a black man just because they suspected him of being involved in some of the recent robberies that they claimed happened in the neighborhood, with any evidence whatsoever that they had on their hands. And at the same time, the whole law that actually they did that under, which is the citizens' arrest, which Georgia later repealed because of the the outrage that was associated with the case. This particular case. So the citizens' arrest statutes and laws were definitely part of a very racist legacy of Georgia, because it came up during the Civil War era period, and it was meant for whites to capture slaves who were fleeing their slavery and trying to join the Union lines. So from that, the legacy has changed, obviously, because the systems have changed, but the racist legacy has obviously continued because, very often this law was used to arrest or capture people who were found of smaller, not even crimes actually, so like misdemeanors and felonies, sometimes even suspected of being in those situations and not with any proof of that matter.
As in this case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in that way, the federal hate crimes charges that is put against them, which we will have the trial by, I think, February, late February, where you will have the jury being selected by that time, will be quite significant, because that will also set a precedent in many ways of how hate crimes need to be considered, especially considering the fact that in not just in South, but like in many states in the United States, you have laws that support or defend people who have attacked because they thought the other person, the victim, was a threat to them. The stand your ground laws and other sorts of laws that were built around a racist legacy will also be scrutinized during this process. So it is going to have a bigger implication in the coming months. How it is going to be handled and how federal jurors and prosecutors will take it forward is something that is something that we need to watch.
Absolutely, and Anish will be, of course, following that case as and when it proceeds. All right, that almost does it from us for today's show. Just a quick reminder that you can get more on all of these stories on our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and of course, updates on all our social media channels. But before we go, yesterday, November 25th, was marked as the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Tens of thousands took to the streets to send out a simple and clear message. We leave you with their voices. Thanks for watching.
Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo decía. Y la culpa no era